Are you taking the ACT and want to quickly learn which math topics are going to be on the test so you can easily learn them? If so, then you've come to the right place. That's exactly what we're going to talk about in this video. My name is Kristina. I'm the owner and founder of Ivy Lounge Test Prep, and for the past 15 years, I've been helping high schoolers all around the globe, just like you, drastically raise their SAT and ACT test scores. We're going to do a quick review of the ACT's math section, and we're going to then drill down into exactly all the topics and then the subtopics that you need to know. What I highly recommend that you do is have a piece of paper next to you, or perhaps the notes section in your phone, and a pencil. And then that way you can jot down any topic I mentioned that you're like, what was she talking about, right? And then that way you know exactly what you need to learn and practice so you are prepared to raise your ACT math score. So, quick review of the ACT math section format. Okay, so the current version of the ACT, which is the one that we will be taking through the first part of 2025 and all through 2024, is 60 minutes long and has 60 questions. And this, of course, is if you are a regular time test taker. If you get time and a half, then it would be 90 minutes. And if you get double time, it'd be 120 minutes. The math section is multiple choice, and there is no reference sheet. So if you don't remember how to do, I don't know, the ratios of a 30, 60, 90 right triangle, well, you don't have anything to look at, so you better have written them down in your brain. Now, if you might be taking the new format of the ACT, i.e., if you are doing the ACT online, then in April 2025 and onwards, it would be this format. Or if you were doing the ACT with your number 2 pencil and a bubble sheet, then it would be September of 2025 when you would have this new format. Then it would be 45 questions in 45 minutes for a regular time test taker. But still, it should all be multiple choice. There will be no reference sheet. And according to what they have told us so far, it is going to be the same content and difficulty level tested. So this video still applies to you. Now, here is how the ACT breaks down its math topics. So these are the topics that the ACT says is going to be on the math section. So here we have pre-algebra, which is approximately 20 to 25% of the test. If you are doing the current version of the ACT, the one with 60 questions, that would be about 14 questions. Then we have elementary algebra, which is somewhere between 15 and 20% of the test. And again, if you're doing the current version, it would be 10 questions approximately. Then we have intermediate algebra, which is another 15 to 20% of the test questions, which is approximately 9 questions out of 60. Then we have coordinate geometry, which is, again, about 15 to 20%, or roughly 9 questions on the current version of the test. There is plane or two-dimensional geometry, which is about 20 to 25% of the test, or roughly 14 questions on the current version. And then there is trigonometry, which is about 5 to 10%, which usually is about 4 questions on the current version. However, here's the deal. Most parents and students that I have worked with don't really know what goes into broad terms like pre-algebra, elementary algebra, and intermediate algebra. I don't even know half the time what they mean by pre-algebra or elementary algebra or intermediate algebra. It's like, I don't know, is that really intermediate? Or like, what are you talking about? They're sort of made up terms, if you will. So here's how I like to delineate everything instead. So here's how I break things down, right? We have fundamentals in arithmetic, which I will go through each of these in way more detail, but just so you know, fundamentals arithmetic, algebra, plain two-dimensional geometry. Then there's solid or three-dimensional geometry, which shows up too. Coordinate geometry, functions, trigonometry, then statistics, probability, and counting, And then what I like to call the miscellaneous ACT math topics. So thus, since this is the way that math makes the most sense to me, after so many years of getting my private students into the schools they want by helping them raise their ACT scores, which includes their math scores, right? Then that's how I'm going to break them down for you, because honestly, it'll make the most sense. And when we go through each of these topics in further detail, I know you're going to agree with me. So if you're just tuning in, my name is Kristina of Ivy Lounge Test Prep. Yes, for the past 15 years, I have helped high schoolers just like you dramatically raise their SAT and ACT test scores and ultimately get into the colleges of their dreams. So I have a quick question for you, and that is, do you have a specific ACT math topic that you don't like? Or is one of those categories that I listed like, oh, I really hate geometry, or oh, I'm super scared of that. So if you have one that you especially hate, just let me know. I want to know. So write it in the comments below. And while you're at it, just please go ahead and like this video and also subscribe to my channel. And then that way you're always going to be the first to find out when I upload a new video about the SAT, the ACT, getting into college, or college application essays. Okay, so now we're going to go through each of those categories that I just told you about, and we're going to talk about exactly which concepts you need to learn. So this is the part where you need to get either your notes ready or your paper and pencil ready so you can jot down the ones that you feel rusty on so you can go back and review. So fundamentals and arithmetic. So to do well on these questions, you'll need to understand a few things. You'll need to understand the number system. So like words like rational, integer, whole number, etc. Like, what do they mean? What are they referring to? We'll need to understand number properties like odd and evens, positive and negatives, prime numbers, right? You'll need to understand factors and multiples. So like greatest common factors and least common multiples. And you'll also need to know divisibility rules, right? So you need to know like if a number can be divided by another number. So knowing all of these will help you immensely when you are manipulating fractions and solving ratios and proportions, which is another thing in this fundamentals arithmetic topic, okay? In addition, you should know how to do order of operations. You should know how to do scientific notation and how to translate English words in a word problem into math. I literally call that English to math translation. And finally, you need to be very well acquainted with percentage problems. So we need to know how to do like percentage of, percent increase, percent decrease, and percent change. So if you know all of those, then you are set with your fundamentals and your arithmetic. And if you don't, then write it on your list so you know what to study. Algebra is next, okay? So on the ACT, you need to understand how to simplify expressions and solve basic algebraic equations, inequalities, and even absolute value problems, okay? Next, you'll need to find solutions to algebra word problems. And what I mean by those are distance equals rate times time problems, work problems, average problems, or even rate conversion questions. And you need to be able to do it easily and quickly. You'll also need to have mastered topics that might be considered algebra 2, okay? And what I mean by that are like exponents, powers, and roots. You might come up with a logarithm question or a log question. You might see a direct or an indirect variation, also called direct and inverse variation. And you will need to know how to factor quadratic polynomials. So all of that would be in the algebra umbrella. Make sure to jot down the ones you don't know so you can study. Now we're going to go into plane or 2D geometry. And so I'm talking about all the geometric concepts that you can draw on a piece of paper, right? So think lines, figuring out angles, triangles, and there are many types of triangles, right? There's equilateral, there's isosceles, there's right triangles, there's a special right triangles, and polygons. Polygons mean they can have infinite number of sides, right? But the ones you're going to come across the most are the quadrilaterals, the ones with 4 sides, like parallelograms, rectangles, squares, rhombuses, trapezoids, and sure, other shapes, pentagons, hexagons, etc. And don't forget about circles, right? So you'll need to know all of those. Now, you might be asked to find perimeters, you might be asked to find areas, you might be asked to find interior or exterior angles, you might be asked to find like the length of a side for a similar shape. So that is 2-dimensional or plane geometry. Next, we have solid geometry or 3-dimensional geometry. So the moment we talk about volume or surface area of a shape, right? And that means the shape is in 3 dimensions. We're talking about solid geometry. Now, here's the cool thing. All of the possible shapes the ACT could ask you about can actually be broken down into only 3 categories: prisms, pyramids, and spheres. That's literally it. If you are a master of those 3 broad categories, you know all the solid geometry you need to know for the ACT. And if you don't, jot it down and learn it. Next, we have coordinate geometry. So whenever any of the equations that we've talked about so far, like a line, an inequality, a quadratic, a polynomial, etc., whatever, find their way onto a Cartesian plane or the rectangular XY plane or the coordinate plane, you're doing coordinate geometry. Basically, when you graph an equation, that is coordinate geometry, okay? So now here are some topics that might show up. You will need to know about graphing lines. You will need to know about the distance formula and about how to do the midpoint formula. You will also need to know how to graph parabolas. If you're super advanced and you're really aiming for like that perfect 36 or a 35 on the math, you need to be prepared for everything. And in that case, you also need to know how to graph circles on the coordinate plane, how to graph ellipses, and how to graph hyperbolas on the coordinate plane. And so that, my friends, is coordinate geometry. Next, we have functions. Okay, so the moment you see something called like f of x, so like f parentheses x close parentheses, then you're dealing with a function. So most of the time, they're simply the equations that you've already been using, but they just replace like y equals with f of x equals. If you've never worked with functions before, then what you're going to need to do is understand basic function vocabulary and the basics of how to like plug in your x and your y values into a function in order to nab a few extra points. Now, if you've already learned about functions in school and you know what they are, then you need to go a step beyond. You need to brush up on finding the domain. You need to brush up on finding the range, determining if a relation even is a function to begin with, right? You also need to know how to do composite functions, where it's like f of g of x. And you need to know how to do inverse functions, and you need to know how to do transformation of functions. Now, if you're one of those people who knows all of that and you're gunning for a perfect score, you also need to know about finding the asymptote of a function on the off chance that maybe the test you take might ask you a question about it. So that, my friends, is functions. The next topic is trigonometry. For a top ACT math score, you're going to need to be familiar with several trig concepts, okay? So the main ones will be SOHCAHTOA. So that's sine, cosine, and tangent ratios. But you also need to know your reciprocal trig functions. What I mean by that are secant, cosecant, and cotangent ratios. You also need to know about graphing one of these on the XY plane, right? So graphing a sine, a cosine, a tangent function on the coordinate plane. You also need to know law of sines. You need to know law of cosines. And if you are gunning for a very top score, be familiar with polar coordinates on the off chance that the test you take happens to ask you a question on it. Might not show up every time, but you got to be prepared if you really want that 36. That, my friends, are all of your trig concepts that the ACT could ask you. So the next topic is going to be statistics, probability, and counting. By statistics, I'm talking about the main four: mean, median, mode, and range. You need to know how to find them in a data set. For probability, you need to know how to find the basic probability of a given situation. And you may need to even find the probability of independent events, like this happening and this happening, or A happening or B happening. For counting principles, I'm talking about how many different ways can something happen if there's 4 possibilities for one thing and 5 possibilities for another, right? I'm also talking about how to do a permutation or a combination, or how to solve a set problem. Think Venn diagrams, right? So many people are in the band, some students are in Spanish, a few of them take both, how many take neither, things like that. So you will need to be able to solve word problems that incorporate counting principles, permutations, combinations, and sets, as well as the probabilities and the mean, median, mode, and range. So if there are any of those that you either don't know or are not even familiar with when I mentioned it, jot it down and make sure you learn it before you take the ACT. And finally, we have what I call miscellaneous math topics. So there are many math topics on the ACT that don't show up on every test, right? And some of these are very advanced math topics that you might not have even ever heard of before, right? Or maybe you will learn it later on this year in your math class, or maybe you do know how to do it, but it's kind of complicated, right? And here's the deal. Only a few of these miscellaneous topics will show up on any given test. The issue is we don't really know which ones are going to show up. So the thing is, if you want a perfect score, you need to be prepared for literally anything. So in that case, you need to be prepared for every single topic I talk about in this video. If you don't need a perfect score, you just need to improve, these might not be worth your time. Obviously, if we work together one-on-one, I could further delineate what is worth your time and what isn't, right? But for now, if you're aiming for that perfect score, be prepared. So you also want to make sure that you know about imaginary numbers, about complex numbers, about compound interest, about logic, i.e. the contrapositive of a logical statement, about sequences and series. So that's like arithmetic and geometric sequences, and then series. And then about vectors, about matrices, that could be adding a matrix, multiplying a matrix, and also the binomial theorem. So again, if you don't need a top score, might not be worth your time, but if you do need a 35 or a 36 for your math section score, then you need to learn all of those. So deep breath. I know that was a lot, and I'm sure you've been jotting down a lot of notes, right? So before you get too stressed out about how much there is to learn, I do have some good news. After over a decade of getting many, many top math scores for my students on the ACT, I jotted down everything into my ACT Math Cram plan. So it is a colorful book that teaches you every concept you need to know in a very concise way, connects the dots for you, and it even helps you prioritize the topic so you don't waste your time. And it even has a cheat sheet in it so you can have all the concepts in a visual manner at your fingertips when you're studying for test day. So check it out in the links below. And if you want to work with me one-on-one, you can also find out how to do that in the links below. Best of luck.